Good afternoon. Welcome to the Family Research Council. My name is Rob Schwarzwalder. I have the privilege of serving as Senior VP here at FRC. To those joining us online, thank you for joining us virtually. It's a real pleasure for me to introduce our speaker for the day, Dr. George Nash. Tertullian, the early Christian scholar, asked famously, "What hath Jerusalem to do with Athens?" He was speaking there about the relationship between Greek philosophy and Christian teaching. I think in our time we might well ask, what hath Barack Obama to do with Herbert Hoover? The identity, or rather the lack of identity between them, is really the subtext of today's lecture. Herbert Hoover was, of course, a president, a secretary of commerce, an extremely successful businessman, and subsequent to his presidency, one of the most thoughtful statesmen in American history. In 1933, in the depths of the Great Depression, Herbert Hoover left the presidency as a virtual pariah, maligned and hated like no other American in his time. During the next 3 decades, he became a tireless crusader against Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal and the other forms of what Herbert Hoover called collectivism or statism. Those of us who work here in Washington are very alive to the fact that the current administration is advancing an agenda of collectivism and statism that might even make President Roosevelt blush. The Crusade years, his long-lost memoir, he wrote late in life, was only published in 2013, nearly a half a century after his death. Dr. Nash, the premier Hoover scholar of our time and really of any time, will discuss Hoover's remarkable crusade against collectivism and its relevance today. Dr. Nash is a scholar, historian, and lecturer with specialties in 20th century American political and intellectual history. He's also an authority on the life of President Hoover. Between 1975 and 1995, he prepared 3 volumes of definitive scholarly biography under the general title, The Life of Herbert Hoover. Dr. Nash is the author of Reappraising the Right, the Past and Future of American Conservatism, published in 2009, and he's also the author of a monograph entitled Herbert Hoover and Stanford University, as well as many other published essays about Mr. Hoover. He's also the author of books and The Founding Fathers, which is a fascinating study. He received his PhD in history from Harvard University, Phi Beta Kappa, and he is a leading conservative intellectual, someone who has articulated the meaning of conservatism historically and in our time, like very few others. It's a distinct honor for me to welcome back to this podium Dr. Nash. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you very much, Rob, for that gracious introduction. It is indeed an honor and a pleasure to be here again at the Family Research Council. And I want to thank you, Rob, and Bethany DeMin, and all of your associates for facilitating my visit and for the courtesies that you have extended to me. Today I'm going to give you something in the nature of a history lesson, but it is a history lesson which I think you will find relevant to many things that are happening currently. In 1964, Herbert Hoover died at the age of 90. He had lived a phenomenally productive life, including more than half a century in public service. It was a record that in sheer scope and duration may be without parallel in American history. His life had begun in humble circumstances in 1874 as a son of a Quaker blacksmith in a small Iowa farming community. Orphaned before he was 10, Hoover managed to enter Stanford University when it opened its doors in 1891. 4 years later, he graduated with a degree in geology and a determination to be a mining engineer. From then on, Hoover's rise in the world was meteoric. By 1914, at the age of 40, he was an internationally acclaimed and extraordinarily successful mining engineer who had traveled around the world 5 times and had business interests on every continent except Antarctica. During World War I, Hoover, residing in London, which was then the mining and finance capital of the world, rose to prominence at the outset as the founder and director of the Commission for Relief in Belgium, or CRB, an institution that ultimately provided desperately needed food supplies to more than 9 million Belgian and French civilians who were trapped between the German Army of Occupation and the British naval blockade. Inside isolated Belgium, Hoover's emergency relief program quickly evolved into a gigantic humanitarian enterprise without precedent in world history, an organized rescue of an entire nation from starvation in the middle of a war. By 1917, Hoover, working without pay, was an international hero. When America declared war on Imperial Germany in 1917, Hoover returned home and became head of the United States Food Administration, which was a specially created wartime agency of the federal government. At the conflict's victorious close in 1918, President Woodrow Wilson dispatched him back to Europe to organize food distribution to a continent careening toward disaster. There, for 10 grueling months, he directed American-led efforts to combat famine and disease, establish stable post-war economies, and in the process, check the advance of Bolshevik or communist revolution from the East. A little later, between 1921 and 1923, Hoover's American Relief Administration conducted a massive emergency relief operation in the interior of Soviet Russia, where a catastrophic famine, Europe's worst since the Middle Ages, had broken out. At its peak of operations, his organization fed upwards of 10 million Russians a day. The communists didn't like him, but they were afraid that their regime might collapse unless they saved the people from starvation. And Hoover, the Quaker humanitarian, brought in food and won assurances that the communists wouldn't steal it or only give it to their followers. A remarkable story, and Americans generally don't know it. All in all, between 1914 and 1923, the American-born engineer turned humanitarian directed, financed, or assisted a multitude of international relief endeavors without parallel in the history of mankind. Tens of millions of people owed their lives to his exertions. It was later said of him that he was responsible for saving more lives than any other person in history. During the 1920s, Hoover, back in the United States now, ascended still higher on the ladder of public esteem. As Secretary of Commerce under Presidents Warren Harding and Calvin Coolidge, he became one of the 3 or 4 most influential people in the United States government. In 1928, the Master of Emergencies, as admirers called him, was elected President of the United States in a landslide, and without ever having held an elective public office. And if you go to YouTube, you can look up that film that was made about him called Hoover, Master of Emergencies, a 40-minute silent documentary. Anyone can see it now. Then, of course, as I'm sure this audience knows, early in Hoover's presidency came the stock market crash of 1929 and the most severe trauma that America has ever experienced, most severe economic trauma. During his tormented presidency, Hoover strained without stint to return his country to prosperity while safeguarding its political moorings. His labors, even now misunderstood, seemed unavailing. His relations with Congress became tempestuous. On one occasion, he was heard to remark, "There ought to be a law allowing the president to hang 2 men a year, and without being required to give any reason." Before his single term as chief executive, pardon me, Hoover's career had careened ever upward. It had curved unbrokenly upward. It was a success story. Now his career path headed pitifully down. Democracy is not a polite employer, he later wrote of his defeat at the polls in 1932. Pardon me. On March 4th, 1933, he left office, as Dr. Schwarzwälder has mentioned, a virtual outcast, maligned and hated by like no other American in his lifetime. And then, astonishingly, like a phoenix, he slowly rose from the ashes of his political immolation. Now came the final phase of Hoover's career, his remarkable ex-presidency. For the next 31.5 years, in fair political weather and foul, the former president became a crusader, a tireless and very visible castigator of the dominant political trends of his day. In the New Deal of his successor, Franklin Roosevelt, Hoover perceived not a moderate and pragmatic response to economic distress, but something more sinister, a revolutionary transformation in America's political economy and constitutional order. Having espied the unpalatable future, he could not bring himself to acquiesce in silence. It is this eventful period in Hoover's career, and more specifically his life as a political pugilist between 1933 and 1955, that is the main subject of the book I have at hand today. The Crusade Years is a previously unknown memoir that Hoover composed and revised during the 1940s and 1950s. Placed in storage after his death, the manuscript lay sequestered, its existence unsuspected by scholars until 2009, when it was discovered among the files of another hitherto inaccessible Hoover manuscript being readied for posthumous publication. This other tome, which weighed a little bit too much for my suitcase, so I didn't bring that along, known informally as the magnum opus, it's 1,000 pages long, addressed Hoover's foreign policy in the 30s and 40s. Part memoir, part polemic, part diplomatic history, it was a scathing indictment of what Hoover termed Franklin Roosevelt's lost statesmanship during World War II. Hoover ultimately titled that book Freedom Betrayed. It was published in 2011. The Crusade Years volume is a companion volume of sorts to this magnum opus work and covers much the same time period. It recounts Hoover's family life as a former president, his myriad philanthropic interests, and most of all, what he called his crusade against collectivism on the American home front during the New Deal era and its aftermath. To appreciate the Crusade Years as a book, as a historical document and its relevance for today, we need to understand the contours of Hoover's long ex-presidency. When Mr. Hoover left the White House in 1933, he was not yet 59 years old, a comparatively young age for a former president. Temperamentally incapable of extended repose, he had no intention of silently receding into the shadows. In March of that year, 33, Hoover and his wife, Lou, returned to California and to the magnificent home that they had built after World War I on the campus of Stanford University. That home, by the way, is still there. It's the official residence of the Stanford University president. Years earlier, as a young mining engineer toiling in Australia, not long after he graduated from college, Hoover had written wistfully, "Stanford is the best place in the world." So it seemed to him in the summer of 1933. But if life in California seemed idyllic, there was little that Hoover found amusing in the news streaming out of the nation's capital. At the climax of the bitter presidential election campaign of 1932, he had portrayed the decision facing the American electorate as more than the choice between two men and two parties. It was, he said, a contest between two philosophies of government, an election that, in his words, would determine the nation's course for over a century to come. The proposed New Deal, he had warned, was nothing less than a form of collectivism that would destroy the foundations of the American way of life. Everything that had happened since had reinforced this conviction. In September 1933, he told a friend that the impending battle in this country would be between what Hoover called a properly regulated individualism and sheer socialism. He had no doubt as to which direction the New Deal was taking. Although Hoover had once described his own social philosophy as American individualism, increasingly now he invoked another word, liberalism. He contended that the progress of American civilization had come from its fidelity to what he called true or historic liberalism. For him, the fundamentals of historic liberalism were embodied in the Constitution, and above all, the Bill of Rights. The discouraging thing, he lamented privately, is that for some fancied economic boom, the American people are prepared to sacrifice their most fundamental possession. Everywhere, it seemed to him, the noxious forces of statism were recrudescent. By the end of 1933, as vast New Deal programs proliferated, the former president believed that the policies of the Roosevelt administration were, in his words, driving more clearly to fascism and Nazism than even towards socialism. Hoover now responded, as he would respond so often to adversity in the years ahead, by firmly putting his pencil to paper. By early 1934, he was hard at work on a book that would confront the ascendant statist ideologies on the terrain where he believed they must be fought, the terrain of philosophy and principle. In September 1934, his book appeared under the title The Challenge to Liberty. According to Hoover, the American system of liberty, a system infused by the philosophy of historic liberalism, was under fundamental assault. Where liberalism championed the individual as master of the state and possessor of inalienable rights, alternative philosophies were now boldly advocating, in his words, the idea of the servitude of the individual to the state. Among these rival philosophies, all sharing this fundamental premise, said Hoover, were Nazism, fascism, socialism, communism, and regimentation, his term for Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. Hoover freely admitted that the American regime of liberty, the traditional regime, had at times been abused. But he insisted that the flaws in the American system were correctable and far less pernicious than the bureaucratic tyranny that would inevitably accompany the collectivist alternatives. In a powerful conclusion to the book, the statesman turned political philosopher now drew the line, and he wrote, "We cannot extend the mastery of government over the daily life of a people without somewhere making it master of people's souls and thoughts. That is going on today. It is part of all regimentation. It is a false liberalism," he continued, "that interprets itself into government dictation or operation of commerce, industry, and agriculture. Every move in that direction poisons the very springs of true liberalism. It poisons political equality, free thought, free press, and equality of opportunity. It is the road not to liberty, but to less liberty. True liberalism is found not in striving to spread bureaucracy, but in striving to set bounds to it." The challenge to liberty was Hoover's first major public statement after he left the White House. Within days, the book was a national bestseller. In its pages, Hoover had tried to position himself as a man of the progressive center, an advocate of what he called real liberalism as opposed to its enemies, reaction and radicalism. But as the former president now realized with trepidation, the middle ground he tried to occupy was not holding. The country was veering sharply to the left. Anxious to clarify his own position, Hoover increasingly identified his own political philosophy as historic liberalism in contrast to what he scorned as the false liberalism of the New Deal. In 1937, he said this to a friend in a letter: "The New Deal, having corrupted the label of liberalism for collectivism, coercion, and concentration of political power, it seems historic liberalism must be conservatism in contrast." With these words of recognition, his political odyssey was complete. Herbert Hoover, who had once called himself a progressive, had become a man of the right. The publication of the Challenge to Liberty marked Hoover's emergence from a year and a half of political exile. More importantly, it announced his post-presidential debut as an ideological warrior and crusader prophet, a role he did not relinquish until his death. Crisscrossing the country in the mid and late 1930s, he delivered an unceasing barrage of verbal fusillades against the New Deal and its defenders. He railed against burgeoning bureaucracy and the stifling and authoritarian impulses that he perceived to be arising in the regime of President Roosevelt. In the process, Hoover became the Republican Party's intellectual leader and President Roosevelt's most formidable critic from the right. Although Hoover himself never publicly admitted it, not even in his memoirs, from 1934, if not sooner, he began to hanker for a return to the White House. Particularly during late 1939 and 1940, he covertly maneuvered to orchestrate a spontaneous draft of himself as the presidential nominee of what he expected would be a deadlocked Republican convention. He hoped, by a powerful speech to the convention delegates, to reestablish himself as the party's giant among pygmies and to stampede the excited delegates into nominating him. His best-laid plans were upended by the rise of a man named Wendell Willkie, who got the nomination, and by some suspicious happenings at the convention involving Hoover's microphone, as readers of the Crusade years will discover. Denied another chance for vindication at the polls, Hoover now uprooted himself from California and made New York City, the nation's intellectual and communications capital, his principal residence. In December 1940, he and his wife moved into a suite in the Waldorf Towers of the Waldorf Astoria Hotel. For the rest of his life, although he would frequently travel and go back to California in the summertime and so forth, the Waldorf Astoria would be his base of operations in his tireless pursuit of influence on the nation's destiny. Hoover's fight to save America from the curse of collectivism forms the centerpiece of the Crusade Years volume. But the book before me is not exclusively about politics. Part of its value is that it enhances our awareness of the remarkable breadth of Hoover's non-political accomplishments during his post-presidential decades. He had a non-political life, too. He had a whole section on what he called his crusades for benevolent institutions, including the Hoover Institution on War, Revolution, and Peace out at Stanford, which in 1959 he described as probably my major contribution to American life. Think of that. It is today, of course, a world-famous archive and think tank, and Hoover had high hopes for what it has become. That was just one of many benefactions to which he devoted himself when he was not out on the campaign trail, so to speak. So, to the end of his days, Hoover truly lived abundantly. Now, you might suppose that this hyperactive ex-president would have had little time or inclination to write a mammoth set of memoirs. But he did, and his Crusade Years volume was only a fraction of it. In fact, the Crusade Years was but a single component in an elaborate literary project that Hoover undertook in 1940, right after his disappointment at the Republican National Convention. That summer, as he turned 66, he began to write a series of memoirs that would grow to comprise 6 substantial volumes. Between 1940 and 44, he wrote and revised what became the first 3. By the autumn of 1944, he was ready to take up the story of his post-presidential life and his battle, still ongoing at that point, against the foreign and domestic policies of Franklin Roosevelt. In September of 44, Hoover scribbled out the first passages of what was in effect the 4th volume of his projected memoirs. Its principal subject would be his crusade against what he called the creeping collectivism of the New Deal. That same autumn, he composed the first chapters of a massive parallel volume that I've already alluded to, devoted to World War II foreign policy and Roosevelt's errors as Hoover saw them. And that parallel volume was the genesis of what became known to his intimates as the magnum opus. So he is doing more than one project at once. And although he had a team of loyal secretaries and for 7 years a very able research assistant, his evolving memoirs were very much his own creation. Every word of his original manuscripts, it appears, he himself composed by hand. And he revised them again and again, eventually putting the chapters into page proofs or printer's galleys. And how he worked. At one point, the total number of page proofs probably exceeded 3,000 printed pages, making it undoubtedly the most prodigious set of memoirs ever written by a U.S. president. In 1951 and 52, Hoover published the first 3 volumes of his memoirs, covering his life through the presidency. Meanwhile, he continued to revise, and he was always revising, the other projected segments. Now, at this point, the idea might be going through your heads that since moving to New York in 1940, Hoover had become a virtual hermit, doing little else but write and rewrite his memoirs. Such an inference, though plausible, would be wrong. He remained very much a public man. In 1946, for instance, at President Harry Truman's invitation, he conducted a survey of post-war food and famine conditions on 5 continents. He visited in 38 countries and traveled more than 50,000 miles. In 1947, Truman invited him to chair the newly created Commission on Organization of the Executive Branch of the Government. Its purpose was to determine how to make the national government more efficient and less costly. It speedily became known to the public as the Hoover Commission. So dominant was he in its proceedings. For the next year and a half, he directed its deliberations at a pace that would have exhausted men half his age, even while he was suffering from a protracted case of shingles. In 1953 came another summons to public service. That summer, the new Republican Congress voted to create a second commission on organization of the executive branch of the government, and President Dwight Eisenhower invited Hoover to chair it. For the aging foe of nearly all things Rooseveltian, it was an opportunity for vindication on a new and heroic scale, a chance to devise and promote an agenda to curtail the federal bureaucracy, stop the growth of creeping socialism, defeat those he called totalitarian liberals, and crown his 20-year crusade against collectivism with success. For the next 2 years, he immersed himself in the duties of what friend and foe alike called, naturally, the Second Hoover Commission. In the midst of these labors, he turned 80 years old. When the Second Hoover Commission completed its work in 1955, its indefatigable chairman turned back to his private affairs and a nagging question. What should he do about the remaining unpublished parts of his gargantuan memoirs? In the summer and autumn of 1955, Hoover again revised the Crusade Years manuscript, and then, at the end of the year, he put it aside and never worked on it again. What happened? Although the record is not completely explicit, it seems that another literary venture had begun to take priority in his mind, a project to which he initially gave the title, The Crusade Against Famine. It grew into a comprehensive, multi-volume history of American enterprises in compassion, as he called them, that had literally saved millions of lives from famine and disease during and after World Wars I and II. He eventually gave this series the title of An American Epic. Along the way, this is the late 1950s now, he turned out another book called The Ordeal of Woodrow Wilson, about President Wilson's travails at the Paris Peace Conference of 1919, when Hoover had been one of his principal advisors and associates. This book proved to be one of his most admired publications. In August 1959, Hoover celebrated his 85th birthday. Rising daily around 5:30 in the morning, he was at his desk by 6. By now, his secretaries were keeping statistics about his lifestyle. During the next 12 months, they later reported, he delivered 5 major speeches, attended 35 public functions, answered 21,195 letters, and traveled more than 14,000 miles. And still, despite growing health problems, he pushed on. Between 1959 and 1964, Hoover published 7 books: An American Epic in 4 volumes, a collection of his letters to children, a book called Fishing for Fun and to Wash Your Soul. He was an expert fly fisherman. That was one of his great hobbies. And another installment of his periodically collected addresses upon the American road. It was an astounding feat. 7 books published between the ages of 85 and 90. But not yet the Crusade Years, nor the foreign policy manuscript that now mattered to him most, the magnum opus, to which in 1962 he affixed its final title, Freedom Betrayed. He wanted it to stand as the unshakable indictment before the bar of history of the foreign policy of Franklin Roosevelt. With the Crusade Years manuscript now indefinitely in limbo, Hoover strained every nerve in his final years to revise and perfect Freedom Betrayed. In September of 1963, he told a friend that it was essentially finished. But before he could publish it, Hoover died in 1964. Under the terms of his will, ownership of his personal papers and books was bequeathed to a family foundation. Evidently concerned that release of the magnum opus soon after Hoover's death might reopen old political wounds and ignite unseemly controversies, the foundation did not proceed to publication. Instead, it placed the magnum opus and related papers in storage at the Hoover Institution, where they remained out of public view for many years. These files, incidentally, are now open for researchers. Perhaps without realizing it, Hoover's heirs included among the transferred documents his other opus, the Crusade Years, which had lain dormant since 1955. There, buried as it were among the files of the magnum opus, the Crusade manuscript remained for more than 40 years. In 2009, the Herbert Hoover Foundation authorized the editing of Freedom Betrayed for publication, and the Hoover Institution at Stanford University invited me to perform the task. While editing the magnum opus manuscript and conducting research in the pertinent files at the Hoover Institution, I discovered the drafts of the Crusade book and its offshoots, a manuscript I did not know existed. With the permission of the Herbert Hoover Foundation and the heirs to the Hoover estate, this long-forgotten manuscript, The Crusade Years, was published in 2013. What, in conclusion, do we learn from its pages? Aside from its often spicy account of Hoover's political activities during the Roosevelt-Truman era and its window into his private life and campaigns for good causes, the Crusade Years invites us to reflect on the factors that made possible his extraordinarily fruitful post-presidential years. At least as much as Theodore Roosevelt, he came to personify the activist ex-presidency. Some historians have even argued that he invented it. The Crusade Years volume calls attention to some of the ingredients of his post-presidential success. His longevity, good health, and superabundant energy. His financial independence and far-flung network of devoted friends. His desire for vindication. His philosophy of life, which exalted practical achievement and the building of institutions that would last beyond his life. And his self-conscious ethic of benefaction. And one thing more, his utter unwillingness to fade away. But Mr. Hoover, I suspect, would be disappointed if we were to read the Crusade Years solely for its anecdotes and insights into his career. Although his book has the flavor of an apologia, plainly he intended it to be more. His chosen title provides the critical clue. Crusade. How he savored this word as he scribbled away at his desk in the early 1950s. The stirring persona of a crusader, with its connotations of dynamism and idealism, was his cherished self-image at a time when many of his enemies had dismissed him as a curmudgeon whom Roosevelt and history had supposedly passed by. Undaunted, Hoover fought on as a man with a mission, seeking not just the recovery of his reputation, but the intellectual and spiritual rescue of a nation that he perceived to have gone astray. In the 1930s and 40s, both Hoover and his arch-rival Roosevelt knew that they were engaged in a contest for the American mind and political soul. What had gone wrong in America since the crash of 1929? Was the Great Depression a crisis of capitalism, a product of Hoover's mismanagement, or a catastrophe brought on by uncontrollable happenings abroad? Was the New Deal a humane and uplifting reform movement that saved capitalism, or a muddled and meddlesome experiment in collectivism? Did the traditional American system of limited government, private enterprise, and voluntarism extolled by Hoover discredit itself forever during his presidency? Or did his successor in the White House launch America on an unnecessary and dangerous spiral towards socialism? Did the New Deal actually save American capitalism, or did it delay economic recovery and poison the wellsprings of future prosperity? As Hoover foresaw in 1932, the answers to these questions would determine the nation's course for perhaps a century to come. Unlike most men in politics then or since, he realized the supreme importance of constructing a compelling narrative of American history, of recent American history, as a weapon in the ongoing clash of political philosophies. Hence his effort in the Crusade years to establish what he considered to be the proper narrative of the causes and course of the Great Depression. Hence his embrace of what he called true liberalism, and his anger at Republican politicians who evaded the ideological issue. Unless Americans correctly understood their history, he feared, the future would belong to the advocates of statism. Reading the Crusade years, one is struck by how resonant Hoover's arguments continue to be. As an unapologetic believer in American exceptionalism, he resisted what he saw as the insidious Europeanization and collectivization of American society. To him, the American system of ordered liberty was precious and must be preserved from what he termed the gigantic poison and philosophic error of utopian statism. Today, one could easily take passages from the Crusade years and convert them into newspaper editorials and blog posts and political advertisements. So current are the problems of political and economic philosophy that he addressed. Indeed, the issues that he raised continue to shape our political discourse in 2016. Herbert Hoover was never an easy man to pigeonhole. It has been said of him that when he was in office, he was too progressive for the conservatives and too conservative for the radicals. But for today's conservatives, he offers, I think, 3 lessons. First, the importance of reasoned argument and not just sloganeering. Before nearly anyone else, Hoover saw the intellectual challenge of the New Deal and began to formulate his case against it. But he did not stop there. For the next 30 years, he crusaded against collectivism on the terrain of historical experience and ideas. He sought to educate his audiences even as he exhorted them. Successful preachers must also be teachers. Hoover knew this, and so must conservatives today. Secondly, the second lesson, the importance of perseverance in adversity. Before he became president in 1929, Hoover's career had been a classic American success story. After his great defeat in 1932, he could have retreated to the wilderness and faded into comfortable obscurity. Instead, he returned to the arena and never left it, and regained much of his lost reputation. Like Winston Churchill in his wilderness years, Hoover never gave in. Never. Third lesson, the importance of keeping the faith when more than a few around you have abandoned theirs. Since Hoover's death, there has been a tendency on the left and the right to treat him as a political orphan, unwelcome in the pantheons of liberals and conservatives alike. But in the larger sweep of the 20th century, Hoover, the unflagging anti-New Dealer, contributed mightily to a critique of ever-aggrandizing statism, a critique that has become integral to American conservatism. He helped to keep anti-statism alive as a political and intellectual force after 1932. It was one of the most enduring of his legacies, and one worth pondering today. Just a few weeks before Hoover died, a young friend visited him at the Waldorf Astoria. Hoover, who had recently turned 90, was now frail and confined to a wheelchair, but his mind and formidable will were unbowed. As he and his guest drank tea together, he suddenly asked her, "Tell me, child, what do you really want in life?" After pausing for a moment, the young woman replied that she liked her life just as it was and wanted it to go on without change. "I have a nice husband. I have a nice apartment. So the answer is, I want a status quo." Hoover looked at his young visitor with horror. "How can you say a thing like that?" he exclaimed. "Because I want more. I want to write a better book. I want to have more friends. I just want more. And I think you should never sit back and say, I want a status quo. Throughout his arduous ex-presidency, Hoover refused to settle for the status quo. In his memoirs, he attempted to tell why. A few weeks after his conversation with his visitor, his race against mortality came to an end, and he never got to write the better book of which he still dreamed. But during his life, he published more than 30 books and left behind 2 more. By any standard, it was an impressive achievement. The Crusade Years volume, then, is the missing link in Hoover's memoirs, the final brick in a literary edifice that he began to build more than 75 years ago. In its pages, we learn the story of his later life, of his political philosophy, and of his tireless crusade to preserve the land of liberty that had given him opportunity for service. It is a remarkable saga told in his own words, his way. Thank you.
We have a few minutes for questions.
Yes, I'd be happy to take some questions.
And I will ask the first one. Certainly collectivism and statism have advanced in a manner that even President Hoover could not have envisioned and have been almost calcified in recent years. What counsel do you think he would give, and what counsel would you give for what could be called the project of undoing and of return to the principles, the founding principles that he fought so hard for?
In his second Hoover commission in the 50s, he tried not simply to make the government more efficient, less wasteful. That had been the task and the challenge of the first commission in the 40s, but he wanted it to roll back its sphere of influence. Hoover basically argued that there were 3 choices that one had in dealing with the government and a free economy. You could have essentially total freedom, unregulated business, as he called it. Or, secondly, government-regulated business with government as umpire. Or, thirdly, government in business, either in a fascist sense or a socialist sense. And he argued that the New Deal variant of these 3 choices was a variant of government-dictated business. So what he wanted to do later in life was to try to roll back the collectivist state. And he had some proposals in that second Hoover Commission, which may or may not be terribly germane today. But at that time that he made that commission effort in the 50s, one of the great dividing lines in the country was how much should the government run the energy sector. In those days, it was public power, big dams, and so forth, versus private power. And Hoover argued that it was permissible in his philosophy for the government to build a dam like the Hoover Dam or Grand Coulee or something, but the government must not then get into the business of competing with its own citizens in terms of the product of power coming from a dam. So infrastructure, yes, up to a point, but not management of business or dictation to business, because he argued once you set down that road, you just get into this web of bureaucratic regulation, and eventually people lose energy. They are enervated. They are unable to really live in freedom and create prosperity through the invention and energies of a free people. So I think he would be stressing that point, especially in our current circumstances when we've lived through the worst economic situation since the Great Depression, the so-called Great Recession of a few years ago, and we are in uncertain times as we speak. So I think Hoover would be arguing, would probably look with amazement and disfavor upon the extent of the regulatory state as it has come to be, and would argue that you have to return to these fundamental principles. I wouldn't be able to guess where he'd want to start necessarily, particularly, but I think he would be alarmed also at the use of executive action or the executive orders. This was a critique he made of Roosevelt in the 30s. If you ever look up this book, there are 3 speeches that he made that are in the middle of the book. in the 1938 congressional campaign, and Hoover was in high dudgeon as he very bluntly critiqued the New Deal, not in personal terms. He didn't attack Roosevelt in personal terms, but he argued that what Roosevelt was doing was proceeding toward concentration of power, diminishing the role of Congress, weakening the independence of the judiciary, corrupting the public by virtue of government-financed propaganda and so on, and creating enemies, to demonizing the opposition. He had a whole litany of complaint, and I read that. Every time I read them, I think, my goodness, I could be hearing this today. So I think Hoover would be arguing for rolling back the state in the sense of returning the government to a more proper function of umpire as opposed to controller. That would be the cornerstone. And also calling for a restoration of the strength and independence of all of our institutions, and particularly in Washington, the Congress, as opposed to what he would see, I think, as an aggrandizing executive. So those would be some of the things that he would say. Now, you asked for my advice. My advice to conservatives would be, and I'm not going to try to be programmatic here in any detail. I'm a historian, but I've given this kind of advice to conservative audiences when I've lectured about the history of conservatism and from the Buckley period through Reagan and up to now. The importance of maintaining a sense of what some call fusion, a sense that there is a movement that you belong to, and that no segment of that should go off and try to go it alone. And there's been a tendency in the post-Cold War period, in my view, for more and more sectors of the conservative community to kind of specialize and go off on their own and not really have an ecumenical cooperative spirit. And I would argue that that kind of ecumenical spirit and cooperativeness is essential. I'll quote the famous line of Ben Franklin after the Declaration of Independence was signed, and he evidently said, how did it go? That we must all hang together, or most assuredly we will all hang separately. So I am distressed as an observer when I see the conservative community today in such a fractious mode, and when the level of discourse is very angry and often directed internally. And it would seem to me that one has to have a sense of cooperation, that each part of the coalition, the conservative coalition, has something to contribute to a common cause. And the common cause is sometimes lost sight of. The common cause, it seems to me, would be resistance to the continuing advance of the secular collectivist state. And it seems to me that that ought to unite most conservatives. They will then specialize in where they want to apply their individual energies, but doing so in a way that keeps in mind the larger picture. And that's some advice, if you want to call it advice, that I gave a day or so ago elsewhere here in Washington. And I feel that as a citizen very strongly out where I'm come from, New England. And there's so much work to be done. And I think Hoover, being the kind of man he was, would not go in for histrionics. He didn't enjoy grandstanding and so forth. He would want to get to work and have a very firm agenda, firmly based on principles that he was unafraid to articulate. So in all those ways, I think he is a figure that we could learn from.
Yeah,
Yes.
it seems to me if you look at the sort of the way history treats Hoover, the left basically ignores him. I mean, the Democrats don't really pay any attention to him, or they just sort of, cast him aside. But it seems to me that, in the last 20 years, the greatest damage that's been done to Hoover, the greatest attack on him, has come from the right, and particularly from Amity Shlaes, and her book, The Forgotten Man. I mean, almost portrays him as a statist, a central planner, this sort of thing. I mean, that's the way I sort of interpret it. Now, you get the interpretation that, her discussions of him are they're pretty derogatory, it seems. Maybe like a little bit better than FDR, but, not that much better. And I was wondering, have you written anything about the Shlaes, assessment, or what do you think of it? Is really the more important
Well,
for this.
I have written, not about her specifically, and she's a good friend of mine, by the way, and I'm an advisor to the Calvin Coolidge Foundation, which she chairs, so she involves me in her projects, so we're good friends. In fact, she even reviewed for the Wall Street Journal in a favorable way the other parallel book. So I don't want to, I want you to know that. What I would say is this. Hoover was long attacked from the left. But since his death, the attack or critique has come increasingly from the libertarian right and from the advocates of what's called supply-side economics, which was associated with Congressman Jack Kemp, and it was to some extent a basis of Ronald Reagan's economic policy in the early 80s. And the history lesson that goes with the supply-side economics, economic theory and so on, is the argument that Hoover made certain great mistakes as president, signing the Smoot-Hawley tariff, raising taxes, and so forth. And so he is not held up as any kind of champion of what they would like to see as their history lesson. They go back to Coolidge. My concern is that both sides of the both critical vantage points leave something out. The left fails to see that Hoover was not this sort of do-nothing, uncaring reactionary in office as president. That was the old stereotype. I think that's largely gone by the boards. The conservative stereotype is that he did too much. So the left said he did too little. Now the newer writing suggests that Hoover did too much or made certain mistakes. What I think they don't appreciate sufficiently is that there were limits to Hoover's progressivism, if you will. He was an activist as president, and he responded as president to the Great Depression with more vigor than any predecessor. That's undeniable. But much of the activism was directed toward having the private sector cooperate in relief measures, and they asked private industry to hold up wages. He did not want the government to come in and start taking over businesses, and he fought against socialism, and he vetoed what became the Tennessee Valley Authority, and he did a number of things which tend to get left out of this portrait of him. In other words, he had a certain forcefulness that some might say was wrongly applied. I'm not here to defend every policy decision, but I think you need to understand that he had a sense that government should be supportive rather than controlling. And he sought again and again, appealed again and again to the private sector, to the leaders of American communities and so on, to take the initiative and maintain the American system in the areas of relief and recovery. So comes Franklin Roosevelt and the veering farther to the left, and after a period of silence for a year and a half, Hoover bursts back on the scene, and he is much more now a critic of statism. He's been outflanked on his left. In the first 2 years of his presidency, Hoover was somewhat ahead of the curve in terms of activism, but he got outflanked on his left, and then he got pilloried as a do-nothing, which is an unfair stereotype. I think also one thing I always stress to audiences is, remember, Hoover was president for 4 years, but he was 50 years in the public eye, and I tried to emphasize that in my lecture. That's not to ignore the presidency, but it is simply to put him in perspective. And what I think the conservative critique doesn't fully recognize is that there were limits beyond which Hoover would not go. And he drew those eloquently in his speeches in 32. The speech that I quoted from, he regarded it as prophetic when he said, this isn't just an ordinary change of government that we're having now, the ins and the outs and so forth. He sensed, and I think he was right, he sensed that Roosevelt had a much more interventionist agenda than he was letting on. And so Hoover fought that, and I think he fought with considerable effect and rallied the demoralized people on the right. Now that produces oddities because Hoover was a progressive early on, and he saw himself as sort of in the mold of Teddy Roosevelt. And as Secretary of Commerce, he was rather more activist than Coolidge. He was to the left of Coolidge, but he was to the right of Roosevelt, and as Roosevelt went left, Hoover became more relentless. So I think that the Hoover record needs to be examined in its totality, and not simply, choosing a couple of policy mistakes which may or may not have been as bad as portrayed, and I don't have time to analyze those in depth. So that would be my response. I think my sense of Amity's book is that she's much more critical of FDR than of Hoover, and I've had conversations with her, and I think she can see some of the Hoover contributions later on, but I wouldn't care to speak for her. And again, I say these in friendship with her. And so my advice to you is to consider the totality of the picture, and I think you'll find some things that conservatives can accept, if not all.
First, I want to just say thank you so much for spending so much of your time, energy, and talent to resurrect President Hoover's thoughts so that we can train ourselves and bring his philosophy forward to save this country. There's so many other questions I have for you. One would be De Re Metallica. What an incredible accomplishment that book was of his over 5 years. But sticking to the more theme of this discussion and bearing in mind Sun Tzu, I come out of a political action background. Lee Atwater was my superior, so I'm accustomed to strategy and tactics and attacking the enemy. Who, other than the ideology of statism and let's say totalitarian ideology, if you're to say these people in particular are the source of the ideology that's attacking us, this Family Research Council, traditional American Christian conservatism, the founding culture, who is that?
Today, you're saying?
Yes, historically. And I'm going to go back to Karl Marx and take it forward to today.
Well, that's a broad question.
And did Mr. Hoover address that?
Well, Herbert Hoover certainly saw that socialism came it's like an invasion of the body politic. He dates to World War I and the sort of war socialism, if you will, of government running the economy as it did during wartime. And he discusses that very much in these books. He was not one to personalize his critiques. I mean, he did obviously by name criticize Roosevelt. On one occasion, in the fall of '32, Hoover was so annoyed at Roosevelt's flip-flopping and being evasive, or so it seemed, on the tariff issue, that Hoover actually denounced him at a rally as a chameleon on Scotch plaid. And afterward, he regretted that he said it. He said, I've never allowed myself to make a personal criticism of somebody, just sort of an ad hominem attack. So he very much disliked ad hominem attacks. He also rejected flamboyance. Now, Roosevelt, as you may know, flew to the Democratic Convention from Albany to Chicago in 1932. It was a very dangerous flight. It was bad weather. Anyway, Roosevelt made it, and he accepted the nomination in person. That was a dramatic gesture, and it was part of Roosevelt's deliberate attempt to say we're not going to be staid and hidebound and reactionary and so on. Someone suggested that Hoover hire Charles Lindbergh, the famous aviator who had just gone across the Atlantic a few years ago and who was for Hoover, and have Lindbergh pilot Hoover around to rallies and so on. Well, that was shot down lickety-split. Hoover said that's just fanfare. I don't recall the exact word, but he said at one point, he said, they can't make a Teddy Roosevelt out of me. So his personality, as well as perhaps some of his residual Quakerisms and so on, all made him kind of an intellectual in politics, so that he would write these long and sometimes ponderous speeches and at a high level of discourse, which I think read pretty well, but they probably didn't turn on the audience and so forth as often. He got better at it later on. But so his whole style would be very different, I think, than what we're accustomed to today. One thing you mentioned, the De Re Metallica, which was a Latin mining textbook composed in Latin around 1500 by a German author, never successfully translated into English. And Hoover and his wife spent about 5 years and successfully translated it. This is in 1912. It's still a classic work on mining. Hoover is one of the few American presidents, I would have to say, who wrote political philosophy. He wrote 2 books of political philosophy. One of them I mentioned, The Challenge of Liberty, 1934. The other one was 12 years earlier, and it was called American Individualism. And it was his answer to what he had just seen in Europe, the rise of socialism and communist revolutions and turmoil over there, and he was very afraid that what he called these diseases would get a foothold over here. But that's the way Hoover approached it, looking at the ideas and trying not to just attack some personality. I mean, obviously, again, had a personal difference, which is a friendship that curdled into a rivalry between himself and Roosevelt. So I would hesitate, I suppose, a little like Hoover to say, well, this person or that person, to personalize who is doing what. Obviously, there are trends afoot. I'll just cite this from one of my own lectures on conservatism. When I talk to conservatives and they're feeling pretty optimistic, I always like to temper that a little by saying, let's not get carried away too much here. And I said to an audience of conservatives a couple of days ago, well, ask yourselves, what have been the most important social and intellectual movements in America in the last 40 years? Conservatism in its various varieties, including social conservatism, I would say, yes, but what else? And I said, as a historian, I would say feminism, environmentalism, and multiculturalism. So I would tell you the American people have been moving right and left at the same time, at least since the 70s. And we're seeing more polarization and sorting out by where we live and all the rest of those sort of things that people are talking about now. Where is the common ground and so on? So I would say that those who are promoting a statist agenda to promote multiculturalism or feminism in certain ways, or the other, would be the people you'd want to consider your opponents. But the point is, name calling or just identifying is I think of limited value. You have to do much more in the area of persuasion. So one of the things that appealed to me in Hoover, as I said in my lecture, was how much he attempted to persuade, even when a lot of people were just hoping he would go away. Even some Republican leaders who thought that he was just over the hill and we want to be modern. We want to compromise with the New Deal. We don't want this sort of prophetic voice coming out and drawing the line. And so there were a lot of uneasy Republican politicians, shall I say the establishment of the day, who in his later years who had fears that Hoover would make impossible the accommodation that they felt they had to make. So that's a little long answer, but I hope it's helpful, because I think that Hoover showed us some ways to make your case without becoming involved in personal, or it seems like personal attack.
We're gonna have to stop now, and then Gabe, if I can ask you maybe just to address Dr. Nash personally. But thank you all so much for coming. This has been an unusually invigorating lecture. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah.